The calendar is utterly ludicrous. There's going to be a weekend of Premier League games, and then 7 days later or 8 days later, the World Cup is going to start.
Hi everybody, welcome back and thank you as ever for joining us. This week's episode is going to focus on England because it's pretty much exactly a year to go until the Qatar World Cup 2022. The qualification campaign has come to an end. England have made it there in some style, which is not unfamiliar for them. They're experts at qualifying for tournaments in recent years, but not quite in getting over the line and winning those trophies. It was the stated aim of the former FA chairman Greg Dyke that England were to win the World Cup in 2022. So they've had a pretty impressive build-up in terms of recent tournaments, the 2018 World Cup, the Nations League, and of course last summer's European Championships. Now comes the true test of that pledge, and we're going to see what Gareth Southgate's team can do next winter. Delighted to be joined by Art de Roche and also Jack Pitt-Brooke, both esteemed athletic colleagues. And I'm going to begin by asking them for a quick summary of how England are set with 12 months to go. Jack, you've written a piece on this that people can check out for The Athletic. We're not going to ask for your thoughts on the San Marino game. You made them pretty clear. But how England look for the Qatar World Cup.
Hi David, I think England look pretty good. I think they would certainly be ranked among the favourites. I don't think there are many teams that they would be too worried about. They have shown consistent progress over the last 5 years. You know, we've seen that with reaching the semi-finals of the World Cup, semi-finals of the Nation League, final of the Euros. They're clearly on the right path. They've got a number of very good players hitting their peak, at least in theory. They've got another set of players who are really still emerging and still improving, the likes of Declan Rice and Phil Foden and Mason Mount. So I think things are looking pretty good for England. I'm not saying they'll win. I'm not saying they're likely to win, but I think they have as good a chance as anyone going into the next World Cup. Art.
Hi, David. I think going into next winter's World Cup, as we should start saying, I think the real positive for Gareth Southgate is I don't believe that there'll be too much turnover from the squad he had in the summer. When you look at the players that were selected, I know it was an inflated squad of 26 rather than the normal 23. You only have a handful of players who are 30 at that time, and I think the large portion of the squad has remained the same, which going into I guess his third major tournament will be a major benefit, I believe, just for the cohesion of the group.
If you're not an Athletic subscriber, you can currently join for a third off the price of annual subscription. That's less than £1 or $1 per week for all of our comprehensive football coverage, as well as US sports, golf and more, all in one place. You can find that link in our description. Now, before we get back to the guys, a question for you. Are there any players not in the latest England squad who must go to the World Cup? Let us know in the comments below. Yeah, they seem to have a decent blend of experience and youth now. They seem to be further along in their journey and development than many of the teams you might expect to be competing for this tournament. We know that circumstances can dictate otherwise. There can be luck, there can be misfortune, there can be injuries, there can be refereeing decisions, even environmental issues around the Qatar World Cup that's going to be so different from tournaments that we've seen in the past. I was doing some reading up before we came on, and it's clear Gareth Southgate has handed 50 players debuts in his time as manager, 18 different goal scorers in this season alone. So, Jack, you've studied this squad so closely. What are the areas that need to be improved? We've talked so much about that need for creativity to retain ball possession, which Southgate looks to have tried to work on with the introduction of the likes of Emile Smith-Rowe and Conor Gallagher. But it's now about that little extra step up. So before we come on to some potential names with Art, how different do you think England might look in Qatar than they look now?
Not very different, to be honest. I think Art made a good point there that we're not going to see a lot of turnover from the squad at the Euros to the squad that went to Qatar. Like the oldest players at the Euros were Trippier, Walker and Henderson, who are all in, I think, around 30. You know, they're not old enough that they're going to have to retire, which will be very different from the 2018 World Cup. You know, Gareth took a lot of players to the 2018 World Cup who haven't played very much for England at all after that. You know, I'm thinking of Phil Jones, Gary Cahill, Danny Rose, Fabian Delph, Jamie Vardy. So there was a big transition after the 2018 World Cup, which we will not see after this Euros. It's going to be a very, very similar squad that goes to Qatar that went to the Euros this summer. And that means really that I think you can probably guess 18, 19, 20 of those England players, because it's the guys that have been playing for England over the last sort of 2 or 3 years since Russia. And that means really that if we're looking at fringe players, young players who are trying to push their way in, they're really competing for a very small number of spots.
Yeah, and that's where I'd like to bring in Art, because he studies so many of these young players and players who could push their way through. I see reports today, the likes of Tyrick Mitchell at Crystal Palace. Mark Gurhey has been mentioned by Gareth Southgate as being close to selection for the last squad. Emile Smith-Rowe and Conor Gallagher did get in after injuries to other players. We've seen Aaron Ramsdale step up to compete with Jordan Pickford. Could he be there to stay in central defence? People have said, could Ben White make his way in? Similar questions, you know, in midfield and even into attack. We know Harry Kane will lead the line, but will somebody like Dominic Calvert-Lewin come back to prominence? Can Ollie Watkins press for selection? So, Arts, what are you seeing in terms of those who may come into the frame come Qatar?
Yeah, I think when you look at the makeup of the squad, experience is probably more valuable in the defensive positions. So when you see how Ben White's played this season, he's still missed out on the England squad because I feel that the experience just isn't at the level of, say, Conor Cody, Harry Maguire, John Stones, and Tyrone Mings. When you finally get that experience, maybe that's when the call-ups will come a bit more regularly, I believe. And I feel that Mark Gahey on the left-hand side would be a very good deputy almost or replacement for Tyrone Mings in that centre-back slot. Then when you push further up the pitch, I feel that's where you get a bit more opportunity to be flexible with your decisions. So we saw in the summer that Jude Bellingham came in at 17 years old at the time. Obviously, he had his birthday during the tournament. And then Bukayo Saka, who a lot of people thought would be used as a wing-back, but was used more as a winger. And that's another thing where you need players who are a bit more adaptable, I feel, because you see, even in this calendar year, Gareth Southgate's used both a 4 at the back and a 3 at the back when he sees fit. So in this international break, it was a 3 at the back in both games, but throughout the Euros in particular, he mixed and matched. And when you want, I guess, players who can retain the ball, as you said earlier, David, and be real creative forces, that's where I think maybe Smith-Rowe or Gallagher could have a real chance, because those are the types of players who have probably struggled to keep their place in Gareth Southgate's squads. I think when you see Jack Grealish, a lot of people were clamouring for him to start games at the Euros because of those qualities, but Gareth Southgate opted for safer options, I believe, or more trusted options, I should say.
Jack, Art touches on so many key points there, such as trust and experience, which brings us nicely onto the debate that is raging constantly around England over whether Southgate picks on form or reputation. Raheem Sterling, for example, is not a regular starter this season for Manchester City, but he's a trusted lieutenant of Gareth Southgate. So do you think that's going to be a really tricky balancing act as the tournament draws into sight?
I think, as you said, David, Southgate is very, very loyal to his key players, the guys who served him so well over the last few years. You know, Sterling has obviously, his form's gone up and down in that time, and he gets stick from various people for various different reasons, but Southgate has always wanted Sterling in the team. And I think, you know, the fact that Southgate stuck with Sterling for the Euros was a really big part of England's success. I thought Sterling did fantastically. You can see this at the moment with Tyrone Mings. You know, Southgate is a huge admirer of Mings as a player and as a person. He's had a pretty bad season at Villa so far. He's been in and out of the team. And yet Mings is still in the England squad, you know, even ahead of, say, Fikayo Tomori, who's playing fantastically well for AC Milan. And that just shows that, you know, Southgate wants, I think Southgate, everything else being equal, would rather stick with the guys who have done well for him over the last 2 years, who he likes and respects, rather than necessarily making wholesale changes depending on who happens to be playing well at any particular point.
Well, we're going to have a really interesting few months ahead, because there's very little opportunity to see England in action before the tournament kicks off. So there'll be a couple of friendlies in March, there'll be 4 Nations League games in June, 2 more in September, and then quite possibly no warm-up matches when the Premier League season is paused before the tournament starts. It means there's very little scope for players to work their way not only into Gareth Southgate's thinking, but above those who are currently in possession of the positions. And it brings to my mind the transfer windows, January and the summer. Art, do you think that any players will be looking to move to get themselves greater prominence in Southgate's thinking between now and then?
I think it's an interesting one, because when you see the players who are on the cusp of that squad at the minute, say Conor Gallagher, who's on loan at the minute at Crystal Palace, I think the question is then, do you trust Chelsea to give him regular first team football? And I think on Chelsea's track record, you'd probably say no. So maybe it's ones where you look for temporary moves rather than permanent moves, because it is a bit more likely to put yourself in the window for Gareth Southgate to pick you, as has been the case for Gallagher this season, where after being at Swansea and coming to Crystal Palace, same with Mark Guéhi, they've both impressed, even though Guéhi's there on a permanent basis.
Yeah, and Jesse Lingard is among them, and it's a name that immediately springs to mind. I'm going to finish this, Jack, with a more political angle. There's been so much politics around the tournament itself, but in terms of the football, it's going to be very difficult with that quick turnaround from the Premier League season to the tournament starting. And then not only that, but they normally have quite a few weeks off after a major tournament like this, but they're going to go straight back into the Premier League season. I remember Rio Ferdinand fairly recently saying it takes several weeks for you to recover physically and mentally from a tournament of the stature of a World Cup or Euros. And we saw what happened in the Euros, the way it took its physical and mental toll on England players, among others, with that heartbreaking penalty shootout defeat in the final. Well, they're not going to have that opportunity. There's going to be club managers who are already voicing displeasure around the way international breaks work, some tension we've seen at various points between the likes of Gareth Southgate, Jurgen Klopp, other managers who understandably are defending their interests, and Southgate has to play the sort of juggling act of pleasing everyone. It seems that he will be signing a new contract to extend his stay through to, I think, the next Euros in Germany. So he's here to stay, but how difficult is that balancing act going to be for the Qatar World Cup?
It's going to be very difficult, David. The calendar is utterly ludicrous. The idea that you could have, there's going to be a weekend of Premier League games, and then 7 days later or 8 days later, the World Cup is going to start. So you're going to have players playing for their Premier League clubs and then flying off to Qatar the next day. They'll start training, they'll meet up with their teammates, and then 5 days later they'll be playing World Cup matches. It's so ridiculous and so different from what we're used to. I think it's going to have a really damaging effect on the first half of the Premier League season, where very naturally players will be conscious about not getting injured ahead of the World Cup. I think it will also have a bad effect on the World Cup itself, because players will show up having not played with their international teammates for months and having to kind of learn how to play, cohesive football together again. And it'll have a bad effect on the second half of the Premier League season, because players will come back for those Boxing Day round of fixtures physically or mentally drained if their teams have done well in the World Cup. So it's a complete disaster. In terms of how Southgate manages it, well, he won't be able to ask the Premier League managers not to use his players. He won't be able to ask his England players not to play in those games. He just has to hope that nothing bad happens.